difficult situation out of the view that we live in a dangerous world. Others speak about the case of global optimism. Words of Larry Summers, the former Secretary of the Treasury in the United States. What is the state of the world and why being hopeful? We have less extreme poverty than ever, also due to the what happened inside China. We have more prosperity, more functioning democracies, fewer local conflicts, and almost no global threat of war, such as we had during the Cold War. Much more interdependency, including in many domains going beyond just the economy, such as tourism, culture, entertainment, communication, etc. Colonialism and imperialism have disappeared, also in Europe, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. All this pleads in favor of optimism, of hope. The anxiety comes from the prospects. We are facing a demographic and migratory explosion, especially in Africa. Climate change is the biggest challenge for mankind. Paris Agreement, even implemented as convened, will by no means be sufficient to bring global warming under the needed 2% Celsius. Our multicultural framework and the international order is under pressure due to growing nationalism and protectionism. A financial crisis is bound to happen due to the very high level of both private and public debt worldwide, which is now even higher than 10 years ago. So what can we do in order to strengthen the forces of optimism and the forces of hope? First, interdependency has to be an objective not only for economic growth, but in the first place for peace. Trade, not war, a no-trade war. This has been the recipe of the EU. It has to continue to be the aim in the future. We shouldn't pay mere lip service to it, because it is so crucial. The ideal is not only a European one, but entails the worldwide free movement of goods, services, capital and people. But these freedoms have to be fair and rules-based, so that the stability of economies and societies are not jeopardized. Second reason of hope. Interdependency is the royal way to prosperity. The experience of the emerging economies such as China and of the European Union has given evidence to this statement. But we have to look at the distribution of the economic growth. Inequality leads to polarization and confrontation. It is the root cause of populism and extremism. It leads to massive migration, huge inequalities. And migration is the biggest political issue today in Europe. Inequality undermines the popular support for interdependency and globalization. It threatens social cohesion. The aim should be prosperity for all. And this is ultimately a task for the nation states. They have the tools to correct the negative aspects of globalization. It is their responsibility. Globalization of economies, capital, human flows, the internet needs a global response, a form of global governance. The answer to the world wars was world peace, an objective enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. It had not really been a success story, but we have avoided the worst. And this is already an achievement in itself. There will never be a world government, but we can agree on world governance, embodied in separate organizations such as the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention, the G20, the World Trade Organization, the International Court of Justice, the United Nations, of course, and the International Monetary Fund. Each of them has its own history and decision-making processes. Some of them have to be reformed against vested interests. For some of them, we have to fight for their survival. We all are in the same boat. And real leadership is the recognition of 21st century reality. It needs no courage to be a nationalist. The opposite rather is true. We love our own country, and leaders have to defend the legitimate interests of their own people. But this is no longer enough to protect the long-term interests of their people. A people without vision perishes. And this is also true for mankind. We have to add a new global dimension to our vision. We shouldn't give up our national identities, but complement them. And that's what we try to do in the European Union. It is not always easy, but the support for EU membership is still very high, even bigger now than 10 years ago. Despite the challenges, a large majority of the Europeans know that in today's world there is no alternative to cooperation and integration. The balance of power shifted dramatically after the end of the Cold War and following the economic rise of China and other emerging nations. It's the economy, stupid, famous words of Bill Clinton, is true on a global scale. We aren't living anymore in a bipolar world, not in a unipolar world, not even in a multipolar world, but in an apolar world. Nobody rules the world. Nobody wants to rule the world due to a lack of financial and economic means, or to a lack of societal support internally, or due to a main focus on national priorities. The most worrying tendency is nationalism inspired by the so-called glorious past. Nostalgia never is a good advisor. The past never comes back, at least not in the way it once was. Ladies and gentlemen, a peaceful rivalry between competing systems is not dangerous in itself. History will show which one is the most sustainable and the most humane. Too soon to judge all this. And paraphrasing former Prime Minister Zhou Enlai, when his assessment was asked about the impact of the French Revolution 2 centuries earlier, he said, too soon to judge. This absence of powers and the global challenges to an interdependent world make cooperation more necessary and more possible. It requires a sense of compromise. There is no life without compromise. Even in every political system, the Union is more than others a living example of a continuous conversation between 28 member states. Ending disputes, also trade disputes, ending conflicts, wars can only be achieved via negotiation and diplomacy. Multilateral organizations, for instance the World Trade Organization, have structures and procedures to settle differences. Conflicts of interest are not unusual, but we should solve them via the usual channels. Otherwise, stability is lost. Dialogue in multilateral institutions is key for creating and maintaining a minimum of trust among global actors. Unfortunately, today, we miss that level of trust. Conversation leads to moderation, and this is precisely what we need. Before dealing with the EU-China relationship, just a few words about the state of the European Union, and I'm devoting this paragraph especially to our Chinese friends. The EU economy is in good shape, growing since 3 years at a pace of 2 and 3% a year, which is good for a mature economy, because we are a mature economy. We are not an emerging economy. Fiscal deficits on average are very low, and the current account of the balance of payments is in surplus. We have created in the Union almost 12 million jobs since 2014. Massive migration flows have been stopped since 2016. We will have decreased greenhouse gas emissions in 2020 with 23% since 1990, better than the objective of minus 20%. Brexit is of course a setback, but it is clear now that Britain will remain close to the customs union and the single market. The Union speaks with one voice about trade, climate change, monetary policy, Brexit, Ukraine, and key issues of foreign policy, such as the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and Iran. Our global partners are increasingly aware of it. Even the US, when it had to deal with the President of the European Commission on trade. Of course, Europe has its own internal problems, but the will to find solutions is still alive and is often underestimated by others. The China-EU partnership is a mature one, with convergences and divergences, on values as well as on interests. But we try each time to find solutions via dialogue, even if it takes time. We share a key common value, peace. And that's why we work together on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and Iran. The EU and China share an unwavering commitment to combat climate change, the biggest moral issue for mankind. We are not engaged in a rearguard action against or about the man-made origins of climate change, and we don't see a contradiction between economy and ecology. On the contrary, renewable energies are a sector of the future, even already of today. But the EU and China have different political systems, based on different values. That was about values. About interest, we have a common interest in a rules-based trade system, especially those rules agreed in the World Trade Organization. But we have differences on our mutual trade and investment relations. The European Union became China's biggest trading partner and main investor. Our trade volume is around 1.5 billion a day, without a free trade agreement. China's success is in Europe's interest. And meanwhile, China has rapidly become a major investor in the EU. But EU investments in China last year was roughly 3% of what we invested into the United States. And other figures from both the EU and China show that EU investment into China is decreasing. The problem is known for some time. It's about time to solve it. Reciprocity is a key word. And there are encouraging signals noticed especially since the last EU-China summit in July. And let me quote from the communique. The two sides view the ongoing investment agreement negotiations as a top priority and a key project towards establishing and maintaining an open, predictable, fair and transparent business environment for these respective investors. Another quotation, the two sides will continue to force synergies between China's Belt and Road Initiative and the EU's initiatives, including the EU Investment Plan and extended trans-European transport networks. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, an investment agreement between the EU and China would be a strong signal in the midst of rising protectionism. The outcome of the meeting between Germany and China in July is also encouraging, especially about joint ventures. All this reflects how big the potential for further growth still is if the conditions are right. The European Union wants a positive agenda with China about what we can do together to our bilateral relationship. China and the EU will then stand stronger in our endeavor for keeping the world economy as open as possible. The conclusions of the China-EU summit are promising, but should be implemented. China and the EU have to show that there are alternatives to trade wars for settling differences. Europe and China have two other challenges in common: the absence of sufficient own energy resources and a steep demographic decline. The first problem has to be tackled in conjunction with climate change and the digital revolution. Renewables and electric cars are part of the answer.